Hello, everyone, and welcome to the National Center on Intensive Intervention webinar. Our webinar today is titled, So What Do I Do Now? Strategies for Intensifying Intervention When Standard Approaches Don't Work. My name is Laura Magnuson, and I will be facilitating this webinar. And our panelists today are Dr. Sharon Vaughn from the University of Texas, Austin, and Dr. Rebecca Zumeta from the National Center on Intensive Intervention. So before we go ahead and jump into our content, I just want to make you aware of a few things. First, the audio for this webinar should be streamed through your computer and your sound has been muted. So Sharon, are you able to advance the slide to the next slide so we can make everyone aware? So we have two options for you if you have questions for us. We have a chat box where we urge you to contact our host if you have any technical issues. And we also have a Q&A box if you have a question that you would like to pose to our panelists today. So we urge you to use those. And we'll try to get to all the questions either during the webinar or afterwards. And for what we don't get to, we will post a Q&A document after the webinar. And second, we will post the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint is actually already posted to the website, and we will post the audio, the archived version of the webinar as well afterwards. So as you can see, I have shared a link with you in the chat box where you can also click to download the PowerPoint slides for today's session, as well as a handout that goes along with it that Rebecca will introduce in a moment. So you can go there and download those as you get a chance. So now I'll introduce our presenters for today, Dr. Sharon Vaughn and Dr. Rebecca Zumeta. Dr. Sharon Vaughn is the H.E. Hartfelder Southland Corporation Regents Chair in Human Development and is the Executive Director of the Meadows Center for Preventing Educational Risk at the University of Texas, Austin. As a Senior Advisor to the National Center on Intensive Intervention, Dr. Vaughn offers her expertise on designing accommodations for students with disabilities who require intensive interventions. And Dr. Vaughn is a distinguished researcher with more than 250 publications on child development, education, and reading disabilities. Some of her most prominent work includes designing accommodations and adaptations for students with learning disabilities. Dr. Rebecca Zumeta is a senior researcher at the American Institutes for Research, where she serves as the Deputy Director for the National Center on Intensive Intervention. She also oversees the Response to Intervention Center at AIR and works on the IES National Impact Evaluation of School-Wide Positive Behavior Supports. Dr. Zumeta has worked on randomized controlled trials of elementary mathematics interventions at Vanderbilt University and has extensive experience presenting to researchers, policymakers, and practitioners. So now at this point, I will turn it over to Rebecca to get us started with our webinar.
Thank you, Laura. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. I am going to start us off with a quick overview of our session objectives and the Center's approach to data-based individualization, and then I will be turning it over to Dr. Vaughn to talk through some of the first sets of practices around intensification that we'll address, and then she and I will go back and forth with some of the various approaches and examples. So to start with, again, we'll do a quick review of our approach at the center, which we call data-based individualization, or DBI. We'll discuss 4 categories of practices and introduce some examples of these practices, and then we'll hold time at the end for questions. So first, we always like to start out with some conversation about what can be learned from research about intensive intervention. And the challenging piece here is that there is little empirical research that demonstrates specific intervention programs for the lowest 3 to 5% of readers, and more broadly speaking, 3 to 5% of students with severe and persistent academic challenges. And by that we mean that these are the students for whom those standardized, high-quality interventions that are generally effective for most students are not sufficient for this population. They may help these students improve in a small amount, but they don't do enough to get them where we want them to be in terms of closing the gap between where they are and their peers or moving toward grade level standards. And so generally what we know from this body of work is that these students present with very unique needs, so that intervention practices really tend to be based on recommendations from experts in various subject areas, and that they are highly individualized and driven by data for the individual student. And so that is what we'll spend some time focusing in on here today, are the kinds of practices that you may want to consider. Within the center, our approach to intensive intervention is data-based individualization, or DBI, and this is a graphic that just really walks you through what that process looks like. So starting at the very top, we have the secondary intervention platform. Some of you may know that as Tier 2 or a standardized remediation program of some type that's been delivered with fidelity, the way it was designed by the author, and where progress monitoring has shown that for a particular student it's just not effective. The student has not responded, and so they need something more intense. For students who do respond, we would say, great, continue with that program and continue to monitor their progress to make sure they're continuing to move forward. But for students where that's not enough, you may need to do some more diagnostic assessment, so analyzing errors in their progress monitoring data, looking more closely at patterns of errors in their classroom-based assessments or other kinds of informal classroom measures, and perhaps even some more formal diagnostic information that may be part of an evaluation plan, an evaluation assessment, or something that your school psychologist may administer. Now, that may be one piece of what diagnostic assessment looks like, but again, it's not the whole picture. These other classroom-based data sources may also be useful. And by looking at those data, that can help us identify students' specific learning needs and allow teachers to come up with a hypothesis about what it is the child needs to make more progress. Do they need more practice with a specific set of skills? Do they need skills broken up into more pieces? Do they need a smaller group? Or some combination of these kinds of adaptations to make progress. And so at that point, the teacher would implement an adaptation or a small group of adaptations based on what they believe the student's needs are. They'd monitor that change and determine whether the student is responsive or not. So they're looking at the intensification, and then they're collecting evidence to see if their approach to intensification worked. So today we're going to talk about some ways to organize how you might plan for that intensification process. And I should say that after you've intensified, you want to continue to collect those progress monitoring data to make sure that the student is responding adequately to your change. And if they're not, that you would be willing to go back and make further changes. So with that in mind, there are these 4 categories of practices that we'll talk about today. The first 2 are ones you're likely more familiar with in your day-to-day work, especially if you've implemented an RTI model. Very likely this is the difference between Tier 2 and Tier 3 in your school, the changes to dosage and time or learning environment. But we'll talk a little bit about those and why those are important. And then we'll move into discussing how to combine cognitive processing strategies with academic learning. And Dr. Vaughn will focus on that. And that was where we'll spend the bulk of our time today because we believe that's a particularly important and growing research area. And then we'll spend some time talking about how to modify how we deliver instruction as well. Before we move into that, there's also a downloadable handout that was available when you, as part of the registration for the webinar, and I believe it's also available on our website, that actually goes through some sample adaptations that you may consider within each of these practice categories. So that might be useful for you to use as a takeaway from today or as you follow along with today's session. So with that, I am going to pass it on to Dr. Vaughn to start talking about practice number 1, which is changing dosage or time.
Hello, everyone. Sharon Vaughn here. Thank you so much for joining. I'm guessing that you are the busiest people right now in education, and it's always the busiest people that take time to learn more. So I hope that we can add to your expertise, and hopefully you can ask some questions at the end and share some of your own experiences. I think most of you probably know that when you want to intensify instruction, one of the first things you think about is changing the dosage of the time. And so what you want to do is increase the quantity of instruction. So before you start adjusting whether or not the research-based practice needs to change, we find it really helpful to maybe add more time during the day or maybe more time for a session, so that if a session is 20 minutes or 30, maybe increase it to 40 or 45, and increase the number of sessions per week. So if you're doing 3 times a week, maybe move to 5, or to increase the total number of sessions. And we've even done split sessions where we do a session and then the student has a break and then we do another session so that the sessions can be more intense and we can focus more on attention. So you may wonder, well, why should I change the intervention time? And the research is really pretty convincing in this area. When we have well-designed interventions that are associated with improved outcomes for most students, what we've learned is that if you increase the amount of time the student participates in that intervention, particularly those students that we have the most difficulty with, students who are more intractable with their learning difficulties, we allow for more instruction, we provide more practice with feedback, and that's really important because students benefit not just from the practice, but from our instructional guidance very specifically about what they're doing well and what they need to modify and increase their engaged learning time. And we know this because students with these more intensive needs really require 10 to 30 times more opportunities to practice as many typical students. So you may wonder, so how much time do we need for an intensive intervention? And the answer to that question is dependent upon what the student has received so far. So the further behind a student is, the more intervention time they need. If they're 1 or 2 grade levels behind, the increase could be more incremental. If they're multiple grade levels behind, it needs to increase by a lot. And that really is reflected when we start looking at older students. So students in 4th grade and beyond, we probably really need to be mindful that they will need more practice time because they are usually further behind. Another common question we get is, what's the length and frequency of the intensive intervention? And so, again, if the student is in 2nd grade and they're 1 grade behind, the likelihood that the intensive intervention can help them catch up within a year is very high. If the student is in 5th grade and they're 3 grade levels behind, the likelihood that they're going to be in intensive intervention for several years is the most likely sequence. So the length and frequency of their previous interventions will help you predict. If they've had really strong interventions for Tier 2 and they still haven't responded, they'll probably need a stronger, longer intervention. If they haven't had much previous intervention work, then they may respond faster. Complexity of the learning task. So if they're doing something really complex like advanced problem solving in math, it may take longer. And it also is affected by the student's personal learning characteristics. If they have low stamina and they kind of tire out with these learning activities after 15 minutes, it's going to take more time. And if they have attention difficulties and so it's harder to get them to concentrate and respond, then that also may take more time. So an important question is how to use that additional time. So it's not just about more time, it's how do you maximize the engaged learning time and minimize the amount of waiting in transition. How many of you have observed interventions and you wonder whether or not the amount of time the student is actually working on the instructional area is sufficient? We really need to be mindful of time on task to provide lots of practice opportunities with feedback, lots of explicit systematic instruction that gives the student the opportunity to perform the task. As I always say, we as teachers have to talk less so students can learn more. And we need to monitor student progress to ensure that additional learning time increases students' mastery of skills. So what are some ways in which you might do this? You can see in the little corner there's an icon of a double dip ice cream, but that's because a single intervention period, maybe 20, 30 minutes a day, may not be adequate. Some kids may need to have 2 20 or 30-minute sessions a day, maybe one in the morning and one in the afternoon. Some of you are providing additional interventions after school or before school. Those may be helpful as well. And we also need to consider how to use entry or exit routines that provide independent or peer-mediated practice so that students get opportunities to have minimal wait time in small groups. And then, of course, we need to reinforce the groups for following the routines independently. So what might a sample entry routine look like? The student comes into the room, gets a timer, practices math facts, writes down the scores. So immediately begins working, doesn't sit and wait for the teacher to direct them. A sample exit routine would be that the student finishes the lesson, does an oral reading fluency practice for 2, 3, or 4 minutes, either alone or with a partner, and that exit routine is sort of the trigger for leaving the intervention. So I think Becca now is going to talk about practice number 2, about changing the learning environment to promote attention and engagement.
Great. Thank you, Sharon. So now we're going to move into, again, what we might do to change the environment that the student is working in, and also to help with some of those behavioral characteristics that often go along with the academic challenges our students present with. As many of you are likely aware, and I'm seeing in the chat box, very often behavior and academic challenges don't exist in isolation, so it's very important to think as we're modifying instructional programs for students, how can we provide programs that acknowledge the fact that some of these students may, while their primary issue may be an academic in nature, that there is also some issue related to behavior, attention, or other kinds of self-regulation that could go into, that could contribute to why they're having challenges. So the first way we think about changing the learning environment is to reduce group size in a way that allows students with similar needs to work together with an adult, and also that a change to the instructional setting that can reduce noise and other distractions and promote student engagement. So this may be, pulling students aside in a classroom. It may be working in a separate quiet area or a separate quiet room. But we know for many of these students, 30 other children wandering around a classroom may be a big part of the reason why they spend a lot of their time not engaged in academic work. So this focused time is devoted to specific skill instruction where the students are struggling may very much need to happen in a place where there are minimal other distractions. So what's the ideal group size for providing intervention? Well, for younger students, we know that it's about no more than 4 students. That is an effective size for students with the most intensive needs. Now, research on one-on-one instruction suggests that while, yes, it can be helpful, it does not clearly have a benefit over these groups of 2 to 4 students. So that may be a place when you're thinking about how to devote resources that, except for in very extreme cases, it may be unlikely that a group of 1 is really necessary, but this group of more like 2, 3, and 4 students is typically ideal for this kind of work. At the older grades, it's not necessarily as clear what that cutoff should be. As students get older, groups can generally be larger than that group of 4 that we mentioned, maybe more in the 10 to 12 range, but there isn't necessarily a specific sweet spot for where groups are necessarily too big or too small at that level. Sharon, did you have anything you wanted to add about that, in particular to as it relates to the secondary level?
No, I just think that resources often determine our group size. So if we have a lot of students in Tier 1 who aren't getting adequate instruction and they're sort of dribbling down into Tiers 2 and 3, and we end up with these very large groups in our intervention, it may be counterproductive. We might be better off serving fewer students in smaller groups and getting their acceleration up a little faster.
Yeah. And another thing that I found, sort of piggybacking onto what Sharon had said earlier about working with students where we may be extending the time and needing to provide them with opportunities to do work where they're independent but engaged, that may lend itself also to thinking about situations where you have much larger groups of students in your classroom than would be ideal at a given point in time, but where you may be working with those smaller groups so that You can pull a group of 3 students and do some very targeted work while other groups of students are participating in some of those entry and exit routines. So, for example, when I was teaching, it was very common for me to have my students who were coming in for a group to spend the first 10 minutes of the lesson actually engaged in some kind of pre-assigned activity that they knew was part of their routine while I wrapped up with another small group doing some more directed instruction, so that they're both getting practice and engaged learning time, and there may physically be a larger number of students in the room, but where you have some ability to work with those group students in smaller groups while still getting them those practice and engaged learning opportunities they need. So that sort of goes hand in hand with the prior note around those entry and exit routines can also be useful for thinking about reduced group size. Also, with that, reinforcing groups for following these routines independently and really spending some time teaching what it means to engage in these routines will be particularly important. For young students, there may be some kind of a sticker chart or point sheet or daily report card or something that you're doing as part of the academic instruction, but that is reinforcing that independence for students and for that on-task behavior. Also, this is a particularly useful time to use peers, parent volunteers, or paraeducators, or in some cases even computer programs to have students engage in practice opportunities. So that time that you're not directing the learning, that they're getting time to practice something either that they've learned the previous day, or that is review of a prior lesson, or that is more generalized practice of a skill that underlies the content you're going to be teaching. And at the teacher's time, because it often is so limited, really should be devoted to teaching and assessing new skills. And to the extent possible, it's very useful to have the teacher be the one who does the assessment, because that helps him or her better understand how subsequent instructional changes may need to take place, because they'll better understand the kinds of errors the students are making. So why small, homogeneous groups? The reason for this is that it actually increases the engaged interaction between students and the teacher that are relevant to them. So if a student is 2 or 3 or 4 years behind and they're sitting in a classroom of students with a wide range of those skills and abilities, it may be that that student who is performing significantly behind other students in the room disengages when the content becomes more difficult than they can attend to, so that when the teacher is having an interaction with a different student, that child is much less likely to be engaged and benefiting from what is going on. In this situation, nearly every, if not every, interaction between the student in a group and the teacher should be relevant to every other student in that group, so that there's opportunities for teachers to give not only get more responses from students and provide more direct feedback, but also so that when the students are doing things like unison choral responding or paired responses or paired work, that the teacher is much better able to spend her time really listening for errors and providing that quick and corrective feedback, and so that almost every one of those interactions is giving the student time to practice the skills that they need to work on. It also allows the teacher to be able to monitor on-task behavior and engagement much more effectively, because again, not surprisingly, when you're working with a group of 3 or 4 students, making sure children are on task and not drifting is much more manageable than when you're working in a classroom of 25 or 30 students. Okay, so next we'll move on.
Becca, I guess it's my turn to talk about practice. Is that right?
Yep, I'm just passing it to you.
And can I'm sorry, can I interrupt?
Sharon Vaughn again.
I just wanted to interrupt really quick. We have a couple requests for both of the speakers to speak up a little bit. Some people have their volume turned up the whole way, and they're just asking if both of you can speak up a little bit.
Okay, I'll use my teacher voice. Is this a little better?
Thank you. Sounds good to me.
Okay. So practice number 3 is really kind of an interesting, and in some ways it's an old idea that's refreshed, but in some ways it's a really novel practice. So let me see if I can explain this. It's about combining cognitive processing strategies with academic learning. And what I really mean by that is that we know that these students, these intractable learners, the ones that are non-responders or minimal responders, I don't think there's such a thing as a non-responder, are students who have problems that go beyond the traditional academic learning that can be easily remedied. We know that. And these students also demonstrate some profile of cognitive process challenges, whether it's memory, self-regulation, self-monitoring, attribution difficulties, attention problems. There are some combination of cognitive processing that interferes with their success at learning the task at hand. So one of the things many researchers are beginning to look at is the ways in which we might be able to both instruct these cognitive process areas like memory and also do that within the service of improving academic areas. Now, here's the critical thing. I don't want you to lose sight of this. We're not going back to that process days when people focused solely on auditory processing independent of academic learning. We're not going back 50, 60, 70 years ago to visual process training without any emphasis on academic learning. So that is not what we're talking about. What we are talking about is recognizing that some students have poor memory and it impedes their academic success. And when students have these memory problems, they may have, for example, difficulty recalling the sentence. So you know those students, you've taught them where they read, and you've heard them read, and they're actually reading with a fair amount of accuracy. But when you ask them a question about what they read, they really have already forgot the sentences they read 2 minutes ago. And this forgetting is a major impediment to their comprehension. So no comprehension strategy will ever compensate for that kind of serious, significant memory challenge. But we're wondering, and initial research shows that it might be promising, to enhance memory tasks in the service of teaching reading, and math as well, so that we might have opportunities to look at the components of a multi-step math problem, to think about how to organize those steps mnemonically in a way that will help students remember them, and to help them then advantage themselves of previous learning to make better connections. So indicators, for example, that a student might have some poor memory and might be a target for integrating memory tasks into academic problems is that they have a low score on those measures of digit span or working memory, or that they frequently forget steps in a process or routine, or that they need repeated presentation of material, or they recall information that was taught previously and they have difficulty with it, depending on the context. Or they easily get lost in a task and have trouble remembering what they're doing and why they're doing it. So those might be some indications. So then you might wonder, well, yeah, I know what you're talking about. I have plenty of students that have difficulty with memory, but what kinds of practices might help reduce this impact of poor memory while I also engage them in academic learning? So we're gonna just talk about a couple of them. There are several, but there are some that you might try right away. One has to do with teaching practices for note-taking and organizing information. So, for example, there can be an assignment sheet that really helps students organize what the focus of the assignment is, when it is due, and what they have to do as a way to keep track of their daily routines and assignments. We can also help students with graphic organizers. Graphic organizers have been very effective at helping kids remember keywords and phrases. So, for example, as they're reading, and they're reading a story about social studies, they might have in the center of that graphic organizer the key word that they are reading about. And then as they read, maybe put a key word in each of those boxes that will help them think of the main idea. Another thing you can use for memory is to help students know when to ask for help if they need information repeated or need to reread a particular segment. We also can help students with memory if we present information in multiple ways. So if we speak and write, draw, or project the information as we present it, if we repeat the important instructions or the key words, and if we model procedures about how students can use visual images for the steps, and also to teach students to visualize information in text, including the stories or the word problems, and to just sort of pause even for a few seconds to visualize the information as a mechanism for remembering it and having better comprehension. We can also teach students with memory challenges routines for some of the important procedures they need to learn. So, for example, little key words or mnemonic devices or picture clues. So, for example, you can see that the tasks that are organized on the left have a picture that goes with each of the tasks as a way to help them remember what they need to do. Consistent routines and reviewing the steps regularly are also procedures that will help students that have memory challenges. It also is useful for students to review prior learning before presenting new information. So to say to students, we just read 2 paragraphs. What is one sentence that might summarize what we just read? Okay, now how can we predict or explain what might happen next? And the important thing about these predictions is that they are not guessing. So we have a lot of students, a lot of prediction going on in schools right now, and a lot of the prediction, frankly, is not a good use of time because students are spending too much time making bad guesses that aren't text-based. So when we talk about predictions, we're talking about using the text to explain how any of the new information that's in the text relates to their prior learning. So what are some other memory enhancing practices? It really helps when teachers model out loud, verbally rehearse what they want the students to remember. So they hold up 3 fingers. There are 3 things that we learned in this passage that I want you to remember tomorrow. One of the things is about who this passage is about. Who knows what this is about? That's right. It's about Geronimo. Okay, so I want you to remember that. The second thing, hold up a second finger, that I want you to remember is not just who it's about, but I want you to remember the 2 key vocabulary words that we learned today. Do you remember what those vocabulary words are? That's right. So we want to remember who it's about and these 2 key words. So that's what I mean by modeling out loud and verbally rehearsing what we want students to remember. You can also develop a mnemonic device. A mnemonic device might be something as simple as taking the first letter of each of the 3 key ideas that you want students to know and tell them to remember that word, those 3 letters make a word. And if they remember the word, they'll remember the 3 most important things they need to know. We can use visual and verbal cues, and of course, we can use the age-old thing of checking frequently for understanding that your students are with us. Another cognitive process that many of our students benefit from when we integrate it into our academic intensive interventions is self-regulation. So what do I mean by self-regulation? Well, self-regulation is really that sort of planning and goal setting that we use that helps keep us on track. So in our personal lives, we might set goals for the day. We might make a list of things we want to do, which is part of our planning. But for learning, we have that same advantage of planning and goal setting and monitoring our goals as a way to regulate what we're doing and how well we're doing. It also helps us stay focused and use attention. So we want to teach students to use these self-regulation strategies. You may wonder why, and it's because poor self-regulation impedes academic learning. So students that don't set goals about what they're going to learn monitor their goals and give themselves feedback and attend to those goals, demonstrate a minimal use of self-directed strategies, and they often have behavior problems and lack attention and impulse control. They have difficulty taking in new information, and they also have difficulty monitoring their learning. So we want to teach them these self-regulation practices as a mechanism to preventing those problems. So you may say, okay, I recognize those students. They're all around me. How do I teach students to use self-regulation in their academic work? So many of the practices we talked about earlier, the memory practices, they're going to help students with poor self-regulation. But you also want to think about modeling how to think aloud when you introduce new concepts, including specifically asking students, what are your goals, monitoring their goals, and using something as simple as a target on a piece of paper to have the bullseye be the goal for the day. And each time they make progress towards that goal, they sort of move the arrow towards it. It's a mechanism for regulating their progress. Modeling think aloud strategies is very valuable. And some of the ways you can do that is to reflect on text or to help students solve word problems. Give examples by giving yourself feedback. Gee, I'm doing a really good job of moving through these slides on the PowerPoint pretty quickly. We have a lot of slides, but it's 2:40 or 10 o'clock or whatever, and I'm making good progress. Check your work and give yourself feedback for things you do well, but also recognize what you need help with. So what would be some examples of this? Let's just do this example. And, of course, I'm fortunate that I have Becca Zumeta, who's a math expert on the line, who can jump in and correct me if I get any of this wrong. But Claire has 6 red water balloons. She has 5 blue water balloons and 4 green water balloons. How many blue and green water balloons does she have? Well, she has 9 blue and green. But here's what students have the problem with self-regulation, is they get caught up with the numbers and they start adding what? 6, 5, and 4. So what you want to do is teach students to think about what's being said and to cross out the information they don't need. So what do they not need? They don't need the information on the red water balloon, so they can cross it out. So here's an example. They circled the blue and green because that's what they need. You can cross out what you don't need, and the next thing you know, 5 plus 4 equals 9. Did you want to say some more about that, Becca?
I think the important thing here, too, is to think about the steps and the sample script that goes underneath the problems just sort of walks you through what this might look like if you were going to be talking aloud as you solve the problem, so that it's very clearly noting, okay, I'm paying attention to those blue and green. I know I don't need red. They put me in there to trick me, and here I am, and now it's time to label my answer. Well, I'm looking back at the question, which is one thing I always know I need to do, and I circled blue and green, so I know that's my label, and now I'm going to label my answer. And so it's just really helping walk kids through the important things to attend to when they're solving the problem in a very,
Thank you, Becca.
very clear and explicit way.
That. Thank you. So, we talked a lot about feedback. What does feedback really mean, especially as it relates to self-regulation? One of the things about feedback is general feedback like, good job, Becca, thank you. Probably not very helpful to Dr. Zumeta as she works with me. But if I say to her, I really like the way you provided a very explicit example to further illustrate what I said, I hope you'll do that in the future, that is a little more specific feedback. We also want to highlight the behaviors that lead to the improved work and help students link their behaviors to the outcomes. So you spent 15 minutes uninterrupted, without being off task, reading this. Then you answered the questions and you got all of them right. Your hard work paid off. So you link your hard work and behavior to the outcome. So, for example, I see you're using the problem-solving steps we practiced yesterday. All of your answers so far are correct. I can tell you're working carefully and getting better at math rather than good job. So strategies that help monitor students' learning include reading the text aloud and thinking about what the what the author is saying, and teaching students to ask, does my answer make sense? So what are some examples of strategies that help students monitor their learning? Involve students in setting goals. And really the goals can be for that session, that particular intervention session, as well as weekly goals. So we think it's important to have daily goals and weekly goals and to keep track and monitor students' progress towards those goals, because it helps students learn to ask themselves questions to be sure they are working well and making progress. So what are some examples of the kinds of strategies that help students monitor their learning? One of the things we want students to do is to be metacognitive. And what we mean is to think about their learning, to think about when they have a breakdown in their understanding. I'm not following her. I don't know what she means by this. When they're solving word problems, they ask themselves, do I understand the question? When they're doing reading text, they kind of know when they have a clunk or an idea or words or a passage they don't understand, and they know what to do with the clunk. They know how to stop and ask questions. Another cognitive processing element that we think is particularly important in intensive interventions is what we think of as attribution. And attribution really refers to a person's beliefs about the cause of their academic failure and success. So, for example, when students have a maladaptive attribution, they think they fail because they have a stable cause, an internal cause that cannot be changed, and that success is due to something like luck. So if you think about it, if your attribution is that your failure is based on who you are, then you don't think there's much you can do to change it. So if you have an internal attribution, and a mistaken way to think about it is, I did poorly on spelling because I'm just not good at spelling. An external attribution error is I was just lucky to get an A on the spelling test because the teacher gives easy words. It's not because I studied hard. So you want students' attributions for their success and failures to be due to the things that they can do to change, like working hard, practicing, giving yourself feedback. So how can you help students have more functional attribution? Help them develop mental scripts that reinforce them for saying more positive things related to their behavior and the outcome. And help get rid of that negative self-talk by illustrating it and correcting it yourselves. For example, 5 out of 5 students got very strong scores on their math, and all 5 of those students worked hard on practicing the math problems. Include students in goal setting and monitoring the connection between hard work and academic success. And of course, celebrating progress through explicit feedback that connects students' use of these more positive functional attributions to their skills and behavior. So things like I did well on the spelling test because I studied hard. If I work hard, I can learn to do new things even if they're hard. And sometimes things don't go my way even when I work hard, but it's not necessarily my fault. This happens to everyone. So hard work alone doesn't mean you always are successful, but it means you're taking a step towards success. So, Becky, you want to talk a little bit about modifying delivery of instruction?
Sure. Thank you, Sharon. And those were great examples and I think really useful ways to kind of start to think about how we are combining not only this piece around academic instruction, but also the other elements that these students often present with when they're having academic challenges. So this is, we decided to focus today on those earlier practices, but if you are interested in learning more about the modification of instructional delivery, we will be posting a module this week that goes into more detail on this fourth component. It goes into more detail on all four of the components, but this one in particular we go into more depth with than we are here. Just being aware of the time, we wanted to open it up for questions for folks. So right now we'll just be talking through this very briefly. But when we think about these students, they're often ones where what we have taught, the traditional way we have taught it to students who are their peers, has not worked for this group of kids. So we need to start thinking about what is it that we need to do that is different for these children than what has been done for kids more generally in the school and even for other at-risk learners. So what we've done for those other at-risk learners might have helped these students a little bit, but if we don't do something more, it's not going to be enough. So the kinds of things you want to be thinking about are the instructional match and how you prioritize the skills that you're going to teach. Now, we are all very aware that we're living in an era of standards, and it's very important to be thinking about moving these students toward standards. But as we also know, for the kids we're thinking about, we're really referring to kids who may be 3 or 4 years behind. And so what will be very important here is thinking about how do we take the student where they are and close the gap between where they are and where we want them to be in comparison to their grade level peers. And so it may not be realistic that in a year we're going to get them to the grade level standard, but what we can do is close that gap. And what's important there is to think about the skills that are most important for getting a student there. So for example, if a student has intensive needs in math and they are in 4th grade and learning fractions, it may not be the most useful use of their time to solely be focusing on the kind of fraction skills other 4th graders are doing, but it may be important for them to learn some of the underlying concepts that may be contributing to why they don't understand fractions. So they may have poor number sense, they may have poor facility with math facts, they may really not understand what fractions are representing in terms of fractions as being numbers. So it may be very important to back up and focus on some of those kind of content areas. And that goes hand in hand with the systematic and explicit instruction that are the items 2 and 3. And by systematic instruction, we mean thinking about the order in which you're teaching content. And with this group of students, it may be that what has typically been a 5-step teaching process for other kids, we may need to break that up for this group of students so that it's a 10 or a 12 or a 15-step process, so that we're almost over-teaching very small, discrete skills so that these students master them before we're asking them to build on top of those areas. And similarly, with explicit instruction, this basically means tell these students what you want them to know. Now, that does not mean that we can't also have activities that help students develop underlying learning, alternate solution approaches, that get them to be more intuitive in their reading of text, to make predictions and so on, but it's also being very clear and upfront with them about what it is we're trying to get to and how we're going to get there, and teaching them efficient procedures for how to solve problems and approach different learning tasks. Number 4 is the use of precise and simple language. So when we're teaching new concepts, we want to teach them the same way and repeat the language that we're using so that they understand the important cue or buzzwords. As I noted before, and part of the reason for those smaller groups is these kids need very frequent opportunities for responding. These are the students that often will disengage if they are not forced to be on task, and they are ones where they need, again, that 10 to 30 times the number of practice opportunities. So it's particularly important that they have those chances not only with teacher-directed learning, but also with peers or educators, classroom volunteers, and so on, so that they get those engaged learning and practice opportunities. Hand in hand with that is the need for very specific feedback and error correction so that these children don't spend a lot of time practicing errors. This is, again, why sometimes that small group can be particularly important, is so that teachers can catch those errors quickly, make sure that the student practices doing it properly, the teacher hears the student do it properly, and that they go back and recheck for recheck the student's ability to perform that task correctly repeatedly throughout the lesson, so that there isn't a chance that they're ingraining incorrect understanding of the new information. And then finally, the opportunity to develop fluency with a skill before being asked to build on that skill, and hand in hand with that, reviewing previously taught information. Because again, as many of you are aware who work with this population regularly, these can often be the kids who you taught them something on Friday and they were doing it well, and they came back on Monday and they don't remember what you're talking about. So it's very important that we, in many cases, overteach the content and check frequently to make sure that they've maintained those skills. And with that, we'll go into the summary of what we've talked about here today, and then we will open it up for questions. I've been seeing a lot of great questions coming in on the chat box, and I'm going to leave it to Laura to give us the questions in a particular order, and then any that we don't get to, we will make sure to respond to in writing and include in the transcript that we'll post on the website. So just as you keep in mind what we reviewed today, it's really important to think about the sort of 4 broad categories of practices that you may think of modifying as you intensify intervention. And those can be time and dosage. It can be how we structure the learning environment. It can be the methods with which we combine some of the cognitive strategies that students may have underlying deficiencies with the academic instruction we're providing. Or it could be modifications to how we deliver and chunk our instruction. Though it's also important, we've covered a lot of different things, and I think if you look at the handout that was a companion to the slides, you'll see that there are several dozen different items that are listed on there. I believe there's probably across the different practice areas, somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 or 40 of those examples. And so it's important to think about making a small number of changes at a time. So we're not suggesting that you tomorrow go and make 40 instructional changes for a student, but rather that you pick ones that you think, given what you know about the child, are likely to be effective. Make those changes, take data, look at their progress, and see if they're responding. And that is how you will determine if the intervention is working for the individual student, and that will allow you to further plan their program, either continuing with what you're doing that's going well or making additional changes to meet their needs. And this is just one of my favorite things to say when I think about intensive intervention. I think it's also a good motto for life. But the point here is that it should all work out in the end. And if it hasn't worked out yet, it's not the end. And so that's what we're saying about these kiddos, is that while they may not be where we want them to go yet, and maybe our first attempts at intervention haven't gotten us as far along as we'd like to be, that doesn't mean we stop there and say that these kids are our acceptable failure rate in our school. Rather, we say, we haven't figured out the answer for this child yet, but we're going to continue to take data and make well-informed instructional changes so that we can hopefully get to a point where it's worked out for the particular student. And so with that, I believe we are just about done, and we would love to open it up for questions. So Laura, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you so much, Sharon, as well. We have received a lot of good questions, so I'm going to try to get to most of those that were asked. One question that I believe this was touched upon a little bit, but maybe if you could answer it a little more explicitly, and I'll pose this first question to Rebecca. The question is, how can you ensure that you're doing an intervention with fidelity if you want to incorporate some of the cognitive processing strategies, but you are using a scripted intervention? So what would fidelity look like if you are incorporating those strategies into a scripted intervention? Can you speak to that?
Sure. Laura, you directed that to me, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I think that's a great question, and I think it's really important to think about fidelity within the context of also using good professional judgment. So a scripted intervention, it's very important that you're using the key terms, that you're teaching the components of the lesson, and that you're taking data on how the student is doing in that program. And if it's going well, great, continue it, and it's likely that changes aren't needed. Changes to the program where you're adding components are less likely to have a negative impact on outcome for the student than if you're taking away or skipping entire pieces. And so for these children, our point is these are the kids where that program by itself wasn't enough. And so it wasn't getting us where we needed to be. So the change we're going to make is to add some kind of component where we're promoting student engagement, where we're reinforcing on-task behavior or whatnot. And so that's part of that student's individualized intervention plan. And so at that point, fidelity for that student would be he's getting the scripted program combined with this approach to promoting on-task behavior or engagement. And so for us, fidelity for this child is actually going to be a combined approach like that. Now I'm going to take data, see how that works, and if it's working, I'm going to continue doing it. And if it's working and I go back to my school's data team or my principal or my special ed director or whoever it may be or the student's parents, and I can show that by making this change, we've been able to move the bar for this child, you're very unlikely to get pushback. Whereas if you continue to do an intervention as it stands and you're not seeing any changes, I think that's where we believe we need to be doing something more intensive. And so that's, as we work, is adhering to the plan for the student and that becomes fidelity rather than standalone fidelity for an individual program that may not be sufficient on its own.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm going to pose our next question to Sharon, and Sharon, if you want to pass it along to Rebecca, that's fine too. But the question is about where Tier 2 and Tier 3 services or these interventions or intensive interventions, about the setting in which they're provided. So someone wrote that classroom teachers are being asked to provide Tier 2 within the regular day in 30-minute blocks while other students are working independently. And sometimes for ESE or special education, teachers might push in for 20 or 30 minutes a few times a week. And they're asking if what we've talked about today for intensifying interventions, where those should occur, and if we believe Tier 3 should always be pull out.
Yeah, I think that's another really good question about the setting for intensive intervention. And I think here's the way I like people to think about that. I like people to think about students' outcomes and progress rather than to focus on where the instruction occurs and whether it's provided by the classroom teacher or another specialist. Now, if the students are provided pull-in Tier 2 or Tier 3 intervention in the classroom, and they are making the kind of progress that would suggest that it's working just fine, there's no reason to change it. But if the classroom is one in which there are a lot of challenges for the teacher to provide the intervention during the class setting, the students in the class are having a difficult time staying on task, there are distractions that prevent the intervention, whether it's the classroom teacher or someone else, from providing it effectively, then students' learning could potentially be compromised. And in those cases, pull-in instruction is not having the desired effect, and it is not accelerating student progress, and teachers and educators may want to make a decision about moving students into a setting that's quieter and allows them to be more successful. In terms of who provides that intervention, I think there are very effective uses of paraprofessionals and other highly trained and supervised professionals that can support the implementation, particularly of Tier 2. When students move into tiers such as Tier 3 or Tier 4 because they have responded inadequately to a secondary or Tier 2 intervention, then I think it's very difficult for a paraprofessional to provide that kind of intensive, individualized, specific treatment that students need. So I know that I gave an answer with caveats, which could be somewhat unsatisfying, but I think that's what it deserves because it really does depend on the situation.
Thank you, Sharon. We've received, so just as a quick update, it's 4 p.m. Eastern right now, and we're going to continue having questions for the next 15 minutes, so we'll try to get to as many as we can, as long as we have questions still to answer. So we've received a few questions, both before the webinar, whenever people registered, and during, about student eligibility for special education and referral for eligibility for special education. What are some guidelines around when a referral might be considered, and how do you know when enough time has elapsed? And someone else posed the question of how if a student has been referred and was not found eligible, yet they are continuing not to respond to intervention. So I'll pose those to you first, Rebecca.
Sure, and Sharon, please feel free to jump in on this anytime. So we at the center believe that intensive intervention can be an option for students who do not have a disability label but maybe who are being evaluated, or for students who are for whom Tier 2 has not been effective and they are part of a general ed program, but where that conversation about special education may be starting. But in particular, we believe that intensive intervention is an important option for students with disabilities who have individualized education programs. So I would, if it were me and I was working in a school, I would, at the point at which a student is referred for intensive intervention, that is the point when I would very strongly consider a special education referral for an evaluation. And the reason for that is that if you look at what characterizes intensive intervention, which is highly individualized programming that is driven by data and individualized goals, that is helping students make progress towards standards and access the general education curriculum, but in a way that is reflective of specially designed instruction, all of those things are consistent with what special education is. So if by definition, in order for a student to make progress, they require this kind of support, then they are very likely a student who is a candidate for an IEP. And that would be my recommendation about when that conversation about special ed referral happen, is either at the point at which they're referred or as you're monitoring their response within an intensive intervention program. Because very likely these kids, if this is what it takes to help them make progress, then making sure that they have the protections in place that allow them to access that are going to be important.
And as a follow-up to that, Rebecca, we also had the question of what are your thoughts on psychoeducational testing to support RTI or MTSS as opposed to psychoeducational testing for ESE or special education qualification?
I'm not sure that I fully understand the differentiation the person asking the question is making, but I think it is a common misunderstanding of RTI or MTSS and using that as a part of the approach for eligibility for a student with a specific learning disability to make them eligible for special ed, that it's either progress data within the context of RTI or MTSS or psychoeducational testing. Typically what it is that the RTI data are used to inform the referral and is used as part of the comprehensive evaluation. So if it is believed at the point of the referral and where the student has been non-responsive and you have those progress data that show that, that's an important piece of information. But it may be that the team also feels that there is some cognitive issues going on, some attention issues, some behavior issues, some underlying language problems. Anything that are potential areas of concern should be part of a comprehensive evaluation, whether you're in an RTI, a school implementing RTI, or a district implementing RTI or not. And when I say RTI, I also mean MTSS, and I kind of use them interchangeably there. But I think there definitely is a place for those things, and that kind of information can help confirm what you're seeing in looking at the progress monitoring data as well.
Thank you.
And if I could add to that, Becca, I would just like to say that in addition to what Becca just said, I think it's important to think about the fact that some of the practices that we identified today for intensifying intervention, actually asked the interventionist to think about the cognitive processing of the student. And one way to do that is to have access to the kind of data that could come from the assessment that was just discussed.
Thank you, Sharon. We received a few questions about how this information applies to students at the secondary level or high school. Particularly, people are wondering if you have any suggestions for secondary schools where there feels like there's not as much time to schedule interventions, or there are issues with students not coming to school. Can you speak to those issues? And I'll pose this question to Sharon first.
Sure, and it's going to be kind of exciting because the National Center on Intensive Interventions is just beginning to do some pretty significant work in the area of secondary treatment as it relates to intensifying intervention. So look for some of that work on the website. Isn't that right, Becca?
It sure is, yes.
And so in terms of this topic, my colleagues and I have been thinking about this for about the last 10 years. So I'll tell you some of the things we've learned, and you can see if they align with your own experiences. First, I think it's important to realize that once students get beyond fourth grade, they may not need, and certainly in middle school and high school, they do not need to pass through increasing intensive interventions in order to get to the most intensive intervention. So if a student is in 7th grade and they're reading at the 3rd grade level, we don't need to say, well, let's put them in a Tier 2 intervention and see how they do. We know immediately that these students, based on their past learning experiences and all of the data that is represented from years of schooling, that they need an intensive intervention. So we can go directly to these intensive interventions. We don't have to go through Tier 2 and less intensive interventions. The other thing we've learned is that these students do make very good progress. So this idea that, we didn't catch them when they were in 1st grade or 2nd grade or 3rd grade, and now what we have to do is, just try to teach them study skills or somehow compensate for the fact that they do not have adequate reading or math skills. This is inaccurate. Students can make good progress. They can make good progress in reading comprehension, but here's the secret. It is not going to happen in 6 months or a year. Many of these students will need intensive interventions for multiple years, but we have very good evidence that when they are provided this for multiple years, they make substantial gains in reading comprehension. So we encourage you to provide intensive interventions all the way through secondary, but not to have sort of the idea that it's going to be a quick fix.
Thank you, Sharon. All right, I know we're getting a few other questions. We have had a few questions about how these strategies might be able to be used to support students in the general classroom or in the Tier 1 or primary setting. And I'll kind of lump with that. We've also had questions about whether or not there's any research that is known by either of you about how these strategies or how interventions or intensive interventions could be used in an online school setting. So we'll ask about the primary and general setting and how those might be supported, but also if you know any information about online school settings. I'll pose that to Rebecca first.
So my knowledge of anything in particular going on in online settings that's research-based is I'm not aware of anything. I do think there are some issues related to access for many of the online academies, so I think that would be something particularly for kids with disabilities that you will want to think about, and in thinking about, having students participate in those, making sure that the online academy is allowing the student with a disability to attend and still have their IEP in place. That's something I think that's particularly important with those. But with respect to the instructional strategies and the research on that, I know less. Our intervention tools chart does have some reviews of web-based intervention programs that are used at the secondary level that may be relevant for more of an online setting, and that might be worth looking into. Another piece there, that I would say is that, I think online academies are often used for kids where the traditional schooling format hasn't worked. So I wouldn't say that it's not a possibility for this population, but I would want to look very closely at progress data and making sure that they're actually attending and engaged in the program if I was to consider that for a student with these kinds of characteristics. And again, very often the engaged learning time and the knowledge of what it is that they understand and don't understand in real time is particularly important for this group of kids. So those are some of the things I'd be thinking about when considering online education for a student with these kind of needs. Laura, and then the other part of the question was how to use some of these in a general education context.
Yes.
And I think I think many of these approaches are very amenable to a general education setting. In particular, seeing the way we break down content, prioritize content, the explicitness of our instruction. And I think in particular, perhaps one of the most important things is the peer-mediated component of what we're doing. There's very good evidence at the school-wide level that peer-mediated instruction is beneficial for students with disabilities and who have low achievement, but is also very beneficial for students with average and high achievement. So by that I mean that an instructional lesson that includes teacher-led explicit instruction at the beginning and some time for peer-mediated practice with a clear structure around it can be very useful not only for our lower achieving students, but also for higher achieving ones. And it's a very meaningful way to have students be engaged in class-wide learning that is relevant to the grade level content. So I think that's one particular area I would look at when considering how to apply these strategies in a more class-wide way. That being said, and I think Sharon spoke to this earlier, we believe that there are many students for whom a class-wide setting and instruction within the context of the general education classroom may be effective, and if the data are showing that, we fully support that. However, we do believe that in cases where it's not sufficient and the data suggests the student is not progressing toward their IEP goals or not progressing toward grade level standards, that there does need to be some consideration of alternate instructional approaches that may include instruction that doesn't always occur within the general education classroom. So I think that we're talking about kids for whom some exceptions to policies may need to be considered because those policies are not working.
Thank you, Rebecca. And lastly, we have time for one more question. So we've had a few questions about how you know when a student has received the intervention for long enough to make a decision about their responsiveness, and also how frequently you might want to progress monitor. So I'll pose that to Sharon, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, I think the question of progress monitoring and how often it occurs relates very specifically to the grade or age the student is performing at. So at the younger levels of performance, like students performing at the kindergarten, first, second grade level, weekly progress monitoring can provide very clear paths for how the student is performing and can be very useful data. As students get older and they are likely to stay in intensive interventions for longer periods of time because they're further behind, and progress monitoring data is less incrementally related to their outcomes. Progress monitoring may occur on a weekly basis during intervention and maybe less frequently in the classroom. So I think grade matters. I think the other thing that matters is the slope of the student's progress. So really making these decisions about whether students are making adequate progress really is based on the student's profile of success previously. So students who have had a very low slope and have indicated very limited progress in previous interventions, as you adjust the intensity of the intervention and you notice a change in the slope, even if they are not accelerating at a rate that is commensurate with grade level peers, this acceleration suggests that the treatment that you have implemented has been successful. So a lot of the interpretation of whether or not it's time to change treatments or the treatment is effective is really based on the student's individual performance and baseline previously. And Becca, I know, is an expert on this, and she might want to add some more.
I think you hit it very well. And in terms of, the only caveat I would say is that you may think a little differently about this also depending on whether you're thinking about an academic or a behavioral context. And the focus here today has been academic, so, that time frame of, especially with elementary age kids, more 6 to 9 weeks to see if the student is responding is a good initial rule to follow. If you're thinking about a behavioral context, however, you may be more inclined to make those decisions more quickly, depending on student responsiveness, and that's something that we will be going into in another webinar. But typically, in the context of behavior, you may be able to make some decisions as quickly as within a week, depending on student response.
Thank you so much, Rebecca and Sharon, and thank you to everyone who attended today. Sharon, can I please ask that you maybe move ahead to the reference slides? We had someone ask about research and what kind of research studies they might find on cognitive processing strategies.
Oh, sure. Let me see if I can find those and bring them up for you. Absolutely.
Great.
Or why don't you just transfer the computer? Because I moved to a quieter room where I thought you would get better reception. Right?
I'm able to do it too, so I just moved it forward.
Okay. Well, everyone will find these in the copy of the PowerPoint slides as well. The references can be found at the end, so that's where you can find the research that supports today's session. Thank you, everyone, for joining. As we mentioned before, we will have a recording of this webinar as well as a Q&A document with a summary of all the questions and answers posted to our website after today, and we thank you for joining. We encourage you to take our survey that you should be redirected to after the webinar. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Sharon. And thanks all for joining.
Thank you.